Nobody expected Frank Costello to walk into Gino's restaurant unarmed on the night three crime families had gathered to divide up his empire. October 3, 1947. Little Italy. Every major boss from Boston to Philadelphia was sitting around that table, convinced they were about to witness the execution of the most powerful man in New York. But what Frank did in the next hour didn't just save his life. It destroyed his enemies so completely that two of them would be dead within a month, and the third would spend the rest of his days as Frank's personal messenger boy. The setup had been months in the making. It started in July when Frank made the mistake that every successful man eventually makes. He trusted the wrong person. Anthony Three Fingers Torrino had been Frank's most trusted lieutenant for 8 years. We handled the books for the gambling operations, managed relationships with corrupt judges, laundered money through a chain of legitimate businesses from the Bronx to New Jersey. If Frank was the king of New York's underworld, Three Fingers was his prime minister. But success breeds envy, and envy, given enough time, breeds betrayal. Three Fingers had been skimming. Not small amounts, not pocket change. Over 2 years, he'd stolen nearly $400,000 from Frank's operations, more money than most crime bosses made in a lifetime. But stealing the money wasn't Three Fingers' real crime. His real crime was thinking he could get away with it by destroying the man who'd made him rich. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Three Fingers approached Vincent the Tiger Mangano, boss of one of Brooklyn's most violent families, with an offer too good to refuse. "Frank's getting weak," Three Fingers told him. "All that political corruption, all those judges and senators on his payroll. He's forgotten how to be a gangster. You hit him now, take his territory. I'll give you the inside information you need to make it clean." Mangano brought in Charlie the Butcher Binaggio from Kansas City and Samuel the Surgeon Carollo from New Orleans. 3 families, 3 cities, 1 target, Frank Costello. The plan was to lure him to a sit-down under the pretense of discussing territorial disputes, then execute him at the table. Classic, effective, fatal. But there was one thing Three Fingers hadn't counted on. Frank Costello didn't survive 30 years in organized crime by being careless. He survived by being smarter than everyone else in the room. And on October 2, 1947, Frank received a phone call that changed everything. "Mr. Costello, this is Detective Lieutenant Mike O'Malley, NYPD." The voice was nervous, hesitant. O'Malley had been on Frank's payroll for 6 years, feeding him information about police investigations and federal activities. But this call was different. "Frank, I got something you need to hear. 3 of our informants have reported the same thing. There's a contract out on you. Big one, multifamily operation." Frank was in his office at the Chrysler Building, reviewing reports from his Las Vegas casino interests. He set down his pen and gave the phone call his full attention. "Details, tomorrow night. Gino's restaurant on Mulberry Street. Mangano, Binaggio, and Carollo. They're expecting you to show up for a territorial meeting." But Frank O'Malley's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're planning to kill you at the table. Who's the inside man? We don't know for sure, but the word is it's someone close to you. Someone with access to your schedules, your security routines." Frank thanked O'Malley, hung up the phone, and sat in silence for 15 minutes, not thinking, just listening, to the sounds of Manhattan traffic 40 floors below, for the hum of the building's ventilation system, for the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the corner of his office. Frank Costello had learned long ago that the best decisions came not from rushing to judgment, but from letting his mind settle into perfect stillness. When the silence was complete, Frank opened his desk drawer and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. Inside were names, phone numbers, and detailed notes about every person who had access to his inner circle. 17 names, 17 people who knew his movements well enough to set up an ambush. Frank studied each name, considering their motivations, their weaknesses, their reasons for loyalty or betrayal. When he reached Anthony Three Fingers Torrino, Frank stopped. Not because he suspected Three Fingers, because he knew. Little things that hadn't made sense suddenly formed a pattern. Three Fingers asking unusual questions about Frank's schedule. Three Fingers volunteering to handle security arrangements for meetings. Three Fingers being the one to suggest Gino's restaurant as a neutral location for the territorial discussion. Frank closed the notebook and made 3 phone calls. The first was to his personal accountant, a man named Jacob Rosen who handled financial audits for Frank's legitimate businesses. "Jacob, I need you to audit every account that Anthony Torrino has access to. Everything, every penny. I want a complete report by noon tomorrow." The second call was to Maya Lansky in Miami. "Maya, it's Frank. I need you to do me a favor. I'm going to give you some account numbers. I want you to trace every withdrawal, every transfer, every transaction for the past 2 years." The third call was to Judge William O'Dwyer in Manhattan. "Bill, I need a favor. Tomorrow night, I want every available police unit within 10 blocks of Little Italy. Not for an arrest, for crowd control after a disturbance." By noon the next day, Frank had the complete picture. Three Fingers had stolen $387,000 over 22 months. The money had been moved through 6 different banks, converted to cash, and used to finance Three Fingers' secret gambling operation in Atlantic City. But more importantly, Frank now knew that Three Fingers was planning to use the meeting at Gino's restaurant not just to have Frank killed, but to position himself as the new boss of Frank's territories. Most men would have cancelled the meeting, called in sick, left town, started a war. But Frank Costello wasn't most men. He was a strategist, and strategists don't avoid traps, they turn them into weapons. At 6:47 p.m. on October 3rd, Frank Costello arrived at Gino's restaurant exactly as scheduled. He came alone, as requested, no bodyguards, no backup, no weapons visible. He wore his usual grey three-piece suit, burgundy tie, and Italian leather shoes. To anyone watching, he looked like a businessman arriving for a dinner meeting. But looks can be deceiving. Gino's restaurant was owned by Salvatore Torrino, Three Fingers' cousin, the perfect neutral location. Three Fingers had suggested, the perfect place for an ambush. Frank now understood. The main dining room had been cleared for the evening. Only one table was occupied, a large circular table in the center of the room, surrounded by 8 chairs. Vincent Mangano sat facing the door, flanked by 2 bodyguards. Charlie Binaggio sat to his right, also with security. Samuel Carollo occupied the far side of the table, and Anthony Three Fingers Torrino sat with his back to Frank, reviewing documents that would supposedly detail the territorial agreements they were about to discuss. Frank walked to the table without hesitation, pulled out the remaining chair, and sat down, with crime bosses. 12 armed men, 1 exit. Frank smiled and ordered a whiskey. "Gentlemen," Frank said, raising his glass when the drink arrived. "Thank you for coming. I understand you want to discuss some territorial adjustments." Vincent Mangano spoke first. He was a thick-set man with scarred knuckles and the dead eyes of someone who killed with his own hands. "Frank, we appreciate you coming alone. Shows respect." "Respect is important," Frank agreed. "Trust is even more important. That's why I brought something to share with all of you." Frank reached into his jacket pocket. Every bodyguard in the room tensed, hands moving toward weapons. But Frank pulled out not a gun but a manila envelope, financial records, audit reports. Very interesting reading. Three Fingers' face went pale. "Frank, what's this about?" "This is about loyalty, Anthony. This is about trust. This is about $400,000. Frank opened the envelope and spread bank statements across the table. "These documents show systematic embezzlement from my operations over the past 2 years. The money was stolen by someone with access to my accounts, someone I trusted." The room went silent. Mangano, Binaggio, and Carollo studied the documents. Three Fingers sat frozen, unable to speak. "Now," Frank continued, his voice calm and conversational, "I'm sure you gentlemen are wondering why I'm sharing this information with you tonight. After all, this is supposed to be about territorial disputes, isn't it?" Frank's eyes moved around the table, making contact with each man. "But here's the interesting part. According to my investigation, the man who stole this money is the same man who arranged this meeting, the same man who suggested this restaurant, the same man who convinced you that I was weak and ripe for elimination." Vincent Mangano set down the bank statements and looked at Three Fingers with new understanding. "You son of a bitch, you played us." "Vincent, I can explain," Three Fingers started. "No need to explain," Frank interrupted. "Let me tell you what happened. Anthony here stole $400,000 from me. But $400,000 wasn't enough. He wanted it all. So he came to you, Vincent, with a story about how I was getting soft, how my political connections had made me vulnerable, how you could take my territory if you moved fast." Frank stood up and walked around the table, his hands clasped behind his back like a professor giving a lecture. "Anthony told you the same story, didn't he? Charlie and you, Samuel. 3 different crime bosses from 3 different cities, all convinced that Frank Costello was finished, all invited to the same restaurant on the same night to divide up my empire." Binaggio's face darkened with rage. "Torrino, you lying piece of shit. You told me I'd be the only one here." "He told all of you the same thing," Frank said. "Because Anthony wasn't planning a territorial meeting, he was planning an execution. My execution. With all of you pulling the trigger. And when the smoke cleared, when the 3 most powerful crime bosses on the East Coast were at war with each other over my territories, Anthony would step in as the peacemaker, the new boss, the man who could unite everyone under his leadership." The pieces fell into place for everyone at the table. Three Fingers had manipulated them all, used their greed against them, turned them into weapons aimed at Frank Costello. "But here's what Anthony didn't know," Frank said, returning to his seat. "I've known about this meeting for 24 hours. I've known about the embezzlement for 18 hours. And I've known about the execution plan for 12 hours. Which raises an interesting question. If I knew this was a trap, why did I come alone?" The silence in the restaurant was absolute. Frank reached into his jacket again, and again every gun in the room tensed toward him. But this time, Frank pulled out a small radio transmitter. "Because, gentlemen, you're not the only ones who made plans tonight." Frank pressed a button on the transmitter. Outside, car engines started. Footsteps echoed on the sidewalk. The front door of the restaurant opened, and 6 men in FBI windbreakers entered with weapons drawn. "Nobody move," Agent William Raymer shouted. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." Frank remained seated, perfectly calm, as FBI agents surrounded the table. "Vincent, Charlie, Samuel, I'd like you to meet some friends of mine. They've been very interested in your recent activities. especially your plans to commit murder in a public restaurant. Mangano reached for his gun, but 2 FBI agents had him covered before his hand reached his jacket. Binaggio tried to run but found his path blocked by armed federal agents. Carollo put his hands on the table and surrendered immediately. Frank, Agent Ramos said, "We got it all on tape. The conspiracy, the murder plot, the territorial discussion. Enough to put all of these men away for 20 years. Except for Anthony," Frank said quietly. "Anthony has a different fate waiting." 3 Fingers were staring at Frank in absolute terror. "Frank, please, we can work this out. I can pay back the money, all of it, with interest." Frank stood up and walked over to 3 Fingers' chair. "Anthony, you stole my money. That made you a thief. You betrayed my trust. That made you a traitor. You tried to have me killed. That made you my enemy. But you know what bothers me most? What?" 3 Fingers whispered. "You made me work with the FBI." Frank's voice turned cold. "I hate working with the FBI. It's undignified. It's beneath me. It violates every principle I've built my career on, but you gave me no choice." Frank turned to Agent Raymer. "Bill, you have everything you need." "We do. The wiretaps, the financial evidence, the conspiracy charges. This should wrap up organized crime activities in 3 states. Good. Then our business is concluded." Frank walked toward the exit, then stopped and turned back to the table. "Oh, and Anthony, since you're going to federal prison for the rest of your life anyway, I thought you should know that $400,000 you stole, I've already recovered it. From your personal accounts, your girlfriend's accounts, your mother's accounts, every penny, plus interest, plus penalties." 3 Fingers' face crumpled. "How?" "Because I've had accountants watching you for 2 years. I knew you were stealing. I just wanted to know how much and where you were hiding it." Frank adjusted his tie. "You see, Anthony, the difference between a good boss and a great boss is patience. A good boss kills a thief immediately. A great boss lets the thief steal until he reveals his entire network, his methods, his accomplices. Then he recovers everything and destroys everyone involved." Frank walked out of Gino's restaurant at 8:23 p.m., leaving behind 3 crime bosses in federal custody and 1 former lieutenant facing life in prison. By the time he reached his car, police sirens were wailing throughout Little Italy as additional arrests were made at locations throughout the city. But Frank's night wasn't over. He had one more stop to make. At 9:15 p.m., Frank arrived at St. Patrick's Cathedral and walked to the confessional booth in the rear of the church. Father Michael O'Brien was waiting, as he had been every month for the past 15 years. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," Frank said, kneeling in the darkness. "What troubles you, my son? I destroyed 4 men tonight. I sent 3 to federal prison and 1 to his death. I used the government as my weapon. I turned criminals against each other. I violated trust, manipulated evidence, and orchestrated the downfall of men who trusted me." Father O'Brien was quiet for a long moment. "Did these men deserve their fate? They tried to kill me. They stole from me. They betrayed everything I'd built. But that's not the question, is it, Father? The question is whether I had the right to be their judge, jury, and executioner. And what do you believe?" Frank considered this. "I believe that in the world I've chosen to live in there are no courts, no laws, no protection except what a man can create for himself. I believe that loyalty must be rewarded and betrayal must be punished, or civilization collapses into chaos. But I also believe that every time I choose justice over mercy, I lose a piece of my soul." "Then why do you continue?" "Because someone has to maintain order. Someone has to enforce the rules. Someone has to be strong enough to make the hard choices." Frank paused. "But tonight, for the first time, I wonder if I'm becoming the thing I swore I'd never become." "What's that?" "A man who enjoys the power more than he respects the responsibility." Father O'Brien gave Frank his penance and his blessing. As Frank left the church, he made a decision that would define the rest of his career. From that night forward, he would never again personally orchestrate the destruction of his enemies. He would never again use federal agents as his weapons. He would never again take pleasure in seeing his rivals destroyed. Frank Costello had proven that night that he was smarter, more ruthless, and more dangerous than any of his enemies. But he had also learned something about himself that disturbed him deeply. He was capable of becoming a monster. The only thing that separated him from the men he destroyed was his choice not to be one. Anthony 3 Fingers Torrino died in federal prison in 1952, 5 years into his 20-year sentence. Vincent Mangano was found dead in the East River 3 weeks after his arrest, killed by his own family for the embarrassment he'd brought them. Charlie Binaggio was shot to death in Kansas City 6 months later by rivals who blamed him for federal attention on their operations. Samuel Carollo served 15 years in federal prison and spent the rest of his life as a broken man who never again attempted to challenge anyone's authority. But the real lesson of October 3, 1947, wasn't about what happened to Frank's enemies. It was about what happened to Frank himself. He had won completely, destroyed his opposition utterly, and established himself as untouchable. But in doing so, he had crossed a line that changed him forever. From that night forward, Frank Costello was no longer just a crime boss. He was something more dangerous, a man who understood that true power comes not from the ability to destroy your enemies, but from the wisdom to know when destruction is necessary and when it isn't. That's the real story of the night Frank Costello walked into Gino's restaurant unarmed and walked out as the undisputed king of organized crime. Not the violence, not the betrayal, not the arrests or the deaths that followed, but the moment when the most powerful criminal in America looked into the abyss of his own capacity for ruthlessness and chose to step back from the edge. Because monsters don't choose to be monsters. They simply forget that they have a choice.